Deze podcast is powered by ACC ICT, de nummer 1 Kubernetes specialist van Nederland.
Zo, welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van de Nederlandse Kubernetes Podcast. De podcast over Kubernetes voor iedereen. Ik ben Ronald Kers en ik zit zoals altijd met...
Jan Stomphorst.
Jan Stomphorst, inderdaad. Ja.
Hallo Ronald.
Hallo Jan, hoe gaat het?
Nou goed, het begint al donker te worden. Want het zijn de donkere tijden hè? En ik weet niet wanneer dit uitkomt. Maar het
qua weer zijn het donkere tijden inderdaad. Ja, anders klinkt het zo melodramatisch.
Ja, weer. Het zijn ook donkere tijden voor mij. Nee, we hebben iets geweldigs wat ik wel heel leuk vind. En waar ik veel aandacht aan besteed.
Security.
Policies.
Ja, nou dat is mooi. En op de HCS Open Platform Experience hebben we iemand gevonden die daar wat over kan vertellen. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Anusha from Nirmata. Welcome, Anusha.
Hey, thanks, folks. So hi, everyone. I'm Anusha. I'm a product manager at Nirmata. So Nirmata is the creator of Kyverno. So before we deep dive into Kyverno, I'd like to give a quick intro of myself. So I've been at Nirmata for the past couple of years. And I've been in the security and policy space ever since I joined Nirmata. But prior to that, I was working at VMware. And that is where my introduction of, infrastructures, virtual machines, and Kubernetes started. I initially started as a software engineer working on the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid project. And later I decided to move to a startup because I wanted to get more insights into the security space, into this Kubernetes space. And it was my first KubeCon that I attended in Valencia that I was, really opened up my eyes to so many, projects in the CNCF space. I was in my little cocoon of, the TKG project. But then I learned about Kyverno. There's, KubeArmor. Just the security space itself has so many projects out there. And Kyverno was one of the fastest growing policy engines. And that, piqued my interest. And then I ended up joining Nirmata. So I work as a product manager here. And Nirmata provides enterprise support of Kyverno and also tooling around policy engines.
Okay, and so... About talking about interest, what was the interest that started your journey in the IT when you were a little bit smaller, a little?
I think when I was 18 or so, I decided to pursue my studies in computer science, and I got my bachelor's back in India. So once I completed my engineering, I secured an internship at VMware. So that was one of initially I wanted to work at all the big fancy IT companies, because of I wanted to get all the free food and all the nice perks that comes with big companies. And that's how I started my career at VMware. But then I worked at several different teams at VMware. Initially, I started, doing front-end development. Back in the day, it was a PHP and JavaScript. So I did a little bit of that. I did not really feel, very satisfied working on, front-end kind of projects, or it was not really fulfilling for me. Then I moved to Ansible. So VMware has its own module in the Ansible galaxy. And I started contributing to that. Then I contributed to SDKs, VMware SDK. So I owned the Python SDK for VMware, vSphere modules. And it was around, I think, 2016 or 2017, VMware bought this company called Heptio, which was, started by Kubernetes founders. And that was where VMware was slightly late to the Kubernetes game, but even then it was new to me, even if it was quite old at the time for the rest of the people. So I then decided to learn about containers, learn about Kubernetes, because a lot of my colleagues back at VMware, they were already contributing to the Kubernetes project. So I had really great mentors I could start with. And I started with the Cluster API project. And again, I had a lot of great mentors back at VMware who were maintainers of the project. So that's how I got into the open source space as well.
Okay,
cool.
And you had a talk here with your colleague, Kyverno, a case study. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you talked about?
Yeah, so Kyverno, like I said, it's been, it's the fastest growing policy engine in the CNCF space. And we see adoption of Kyverno across industries. It could be banking, retail, fast food chains. There's the number of companies and organizations that have adopted Kyverno is beyond any particular sector. And today we had this talk with HCS is Nirmata's partner. So the talk was mostly around how HCS implemented Kyverno in one of their client environments. And Kyverno works with any kind of Kubernetes cluster. It can be OpenShift, EKS, AKS, vanilla Kubernetes, anything, to be honest. But this talk mainly focused on how Kyverno can be optimally used in OpenShift environments. Because what we have seen with other users is depending on your cloud environment, the use case might vary. Like if you're on OpenShift, mostly automation use cases resonate more with our OpenShift users because you don't really have to manage controllers on your own. You don't have to write new operators and controllers for every little automation task that you have to do. Instead, you can write Kyverno policies. But again, we have users on EKS, AKS. For them, use cases around port security is more important. But today we focus mostly on OpenShift.
Okay. If we go back, the big question is, what is Kyverno in the biggest way? What is Kyverno?
Yeah, I think I can give a tidbit on how Kyverno itself started. Like I said, Nirmata is the creator of Kyverno. So Kyverno was an in-house project at Nirmata. So we just developed it as a policy or a rule module, like a very small piece. So I heard this anecdote from Jim, who is our CEO and the creator of Nirmata himself. So he said that they did not really want to use OPA because they didn't want to write policies in a different language because the learning curve was high for them. That's how they started with, because everything in Kubernetes is YAML, so why not policies in YAML? So that's how Kyverno started as a very small project, and then they decided to open source it just to see whether people are going to use it. Is there going to be adoption for this? Or because otherwise, if we just develop something in-house, the burden is on us to now maintain and evolve the project, as opposed to, having the benefit from the community where everybody contributes to it and it becomes more robust and reliable because it is, hardened by so many real world use cases as opposed to only your own single use case. So that's how Kyverno we donated to CNCF. It started out as a sandbox project, just like any other project. But very soon we started seeing so much adoption, and mainly because of its ease of use. So Kyverno started out as completely Kubernetes-native. So for all your Kubernetes resources, you could write policies in simple YAML. So there was very little learning curve. If you're working with Kubernetes, 99.9% you have worked with YAML. You know how to read and write YAML. So just learning Kyverno was easy. That's how the adoption grew. And to answer your question, Kyverno is basically an admission controller in Kubernetes. So in Kubernetes, you have dynamic admission controllers. There are mutating admission webhooks. There's validating admission webhooks. So Kyverno makes use of this. So what happens is whenever your API server receives any request, for example, if you now do kubectl get pods. So the first thing that happens is obviously API server receives the request. Then it goes to the authorization change. Are you as a user allowed to, do that operation or not? Are you authorized to list pods or not? If that is successful, then comes the webhook part. So first is always the mutating admission webhook. So here you are literally allowed to change your request. You are allowed to mutate your request. So this is one of the most powerful features of Kyverno. Any incoming request, you can mutate it. If there is a new deployment that you're creating, you can add any missing labels that your team forgot to add. Now this, as a platform team, this becomes easy for you to do any housekeeping activity. You can say this set of deployments belong to team ABC.
So a different, you can add those labels based on a specific user or a specific situation.
Yes, a specific situation. So you will have to, I can say, for deployments that are in prod namespace, then add label prod or label, say, the team name that deployed that particular application. So ideally, the team itself has to add the label, but in case they forget, you can ensure that that's ultimately going to get added to the deployment, and this you can enforce as a policy. So you can just write a policy that says, if a deployment is coming to the prod namespace, add this label, and that gets added.
And the same policies can also enforce things.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is the validating admission part. So the validating admission webhook, ultimately you have to say it evaluates to a Boolean, true or false. So if the policy rule that you write, if it evaluates to false, it can block your request itself. Or if it evaluates to true, it can go persist into etcd. So in Kubernetes, if it's persist into etcd, it means your deployment is successful. It's running in the cluster. But Kyverno, you can run in two modes. You can run it in audit mode or enforce mode. We typically recommend to run in enforce mode because that is the highest security that you can provide.
Yeah.
But the reality is not everybody is comfortable in deploying policies in enforce mode. Even though the intention is there with platform teams, they want everything to be secure. There's a lot of friction with development teams where they don't really want their deployments getting blocked. Or it might be the case where in, say, sandbox environment or stage environment, you don't really want to block stuff. You just want to audit them. So that is where you can run Kyverno in audit mode. It will give you a report that, hey, this deployment is not configured correctly, but it's not going to block your deployment process itself.
Yeah, but you can start in the audit mode, and from there you can do the block mode, right?
So if you're just starting out with Kyverno, our advice is always start in an audit mode so that at least you get a stock of what are all the misconfigurations that are there and then start fixing them one by one.
Kost het beheer van Kubernetes je veel tijd en expertise? Maak kennis met ACC ICT. Zij ontzorgen je volledig met managed Kubernetes diensten op elke cloud. Gecertificeerde specialisten zorgen voor compleet beheer, 24/7 support en optimale beveiliging. Jij kunt je focussen op je core business, terwijl je Kubernetes-omgeving in betrouwbare handen is. Managed Kubernetes van ACC ICT. Jouw zorg, onze expertise. Bezoek accict.com.
Yeah.
Awesome. What is, you just said it a little bit, but what is the main reason to use Kyverno instead of OPA or another admission controller?
The topmost reason that at least I have seen over the past 2 years, like talking to a lot of users, is the ease of use. Like I said, everybody who works with Kubernetes knows YAML. So at least the language part is, out of their way. Now they have to learn what are the best practices to enforce. So that is the actual thing that you have to work on, right? Instead of learning a new language. So that is the topmost reason. And the other things, like Kyverno was born in the cloud native world. So it is designed for Kubernetes native resources. So the things like validation of resources, mutation, there's even generation. So all of these comes out of the box in Kyverno. So if you even go back to the first version of Kyverno, all of this is available right there, as opposed to other policy engines who are still catching up because they are general purpose policy engines and they're not specifically built for Kubernetes. So I would say that it is more robust. All of these features are more robust in Kyverno.
Okay, cool. And if you start with Kyverno, are you getting a set of rules already, or do you need to write all the rules yourself?
Kyverno is, again, it is Kubernetes native. When I say that, it consists of several CRDs and controllers itself. So there are different controllers, admission controllers, background controllers. So you can turn on off any of these controllers based on your use case. But our open source policy library has more than 400 policies today. So if you're getting started with Kyverno, you don't have to start from scratch. Most likely, whatever your use case is, it could be in any cloud with any other tooling. An example already exists, so you can just take that and modify it to whatever you want.
So it's really easy to use and easy to start with.
Yeah, definitely. And also the Kyverno Slack channel on Kubernetes Slack is very active. There are about 3,000 plus people already on it. And the maintainers also, they make sure they answer each and every question. So
that's awesome.
If you're just getting started, or if you're already using and have any questions, feel free to just post there.
It's not that often that you see a Slack channel that busy.
Yes, and that was one of the reasons that I was very excited by when I decided to join Nirmata was because, again, my reason to join Nirmata was because of Kyverno. Kyverno has a lot of potential. The community was very thriving because I have seen other Slack channels, to be honest, you ask any question and it goes unanswered. And rightly so. I mean, it's community, it's best effort. It depends on maintainers' times and other things. But for a project like Kyverno, which is just getting started and having so much adoption, I think it's really great. Like the volume of questions that we get on a per day basis and they get answered is really too great.
So if you have so if I would start with a Kubernetes deployment, starting up my cluster, Kyverno can be one of those things that would be like, would you say mandatory to install right away, or do you say, and what other tips and tricks do you have to use besides Kyverno? What works really well in combination with Kyverno?
Yeah, so we recommend you install Kyverno right from the moment you provision a cluster so that Kyverno is running. But depending on if it's a production cluster, we have several recommendations on how to configure Kyverno itself. Like if you want to run it in HA mode, or there is also a setting where, because Kyverno sits in the critical path of admission control, it's very important that Kyverno itself is up and running.
Yeah.
Because if Kyverno goes down, your API server cannot redirect the request and your cluster can come down, and you don't want that in production at least. So we as Nirmata, we provide suggestions on how to set up Kyverno itself, but there are modes in which you can run Kyverno where it does not affect your entire cluster. So if you're running in a non-prod environment, you can definitely use those settings. But it is always advised to install Kyverno at the time of cluster provision. And you can install a set of base policies that are mandatory to your organization also at the time of cluster or namespace provision, so that they're already there. And we also recommend there's a CLI available, Kyverno CLI, and Nirmata also provides a CLI called NCTL. So you can run Kyverno engine in your CI pipeline. So for example, if you're a developer, you're making some changes to your deployment manifest. So the same policies that would have applied in your cluster, now you can apply that in your CI pipeline.
Do you like a shift left philosophy?
Yes, shift left philosophy, where you just have to, your developer now gets feedback on, hey, they're doing something wrong. Even if their code were to merge, their deployment would have been blocked by the cluster. Instead, why not fix it sooner?
Yeah. And are there any other recommendation that you would suggest running besides Kyverno? There are other ways to do security on your cluster. Kyverno can be one part of that. Do you have any recommendations?
Kyverno is mostly for preventing misconfigurations in the cluster. So in terms of security, like misconfigurations are a major piece, but the now second aspect is vulnerability, right? CVs, and you might be aware of so many tools like Trivi, Gripe that scan images for CVs. So you definitely need to have vulnerability scanners. So Kyverno cannot replace vulnerability scanners, but Kyverno can definitely complement if you're already running Trivi and other scanning tools. So one very good example is, suppose you're running Trivi to run image scans and you get a CV report, for example. Kyverno can read your CV report, and you can write policies to say if there are CVs which are critical or high or any other CVSS score, then block that deployment. But if it is of a low CV, then you don't really care that much. You are okay to run that in your environment. So you can combine Kyverno policies with your CV reports that was generated, or even SBOMs that are generated. So you can see that there are vulnerable dependencies that are there. And if it's of low criticality, you're probably fine. But if it is higher, you want to block those deployments. And there's a blog post that we had done, I think early last year probably, was, these tools, you can always scan your image registries to say, generate these CV reports every week, for example. And for some reason, say your pipeline broke and the CV reports were not generated. You can actually have a Kyverno policy that can validate whether your report is a week old. If it is more than a week, it will alert you saying, hey, something, messed up in your pipeline and your CV reports are not being generated. So Kyverno, not just for security use cases, there's a whole ton of automation use cases that you can do with Kyverno.
Cool.
Yeah.
And can you said Kyverno is alerting things, but how can it send Slack channel messages, or can it send emails, or how does it alert you?
So Kyverno it runs as a deployment in your cluster, and it generates policy reports. So policy reports are again CRDs. So what you can do is you can query it like any other Kubernetes resource. You can do kubectl get policy reports, and its policy report is a standard. There's a working group policy in Kubernetes, and it's a standard API format that it follows. You can build tooling on top of this. Now, because this is standard spec, you can write a tool that says whenever a new policy report is generated, send a message to Slack. So all these
you need extra tooling for that.
Yes.
So we can ask the CRD what was the is there any problem, and then you can. So you need manually write tooling.
Yeah, you can monitor like if there are any new policy reports in your namespace, you can shoot a message or Slack message or email. So that is one of the things that we do at Nirmata. So we also provide tooling around Kyverno and policy reports. So if you can set alarms and alerts for your namespace. So if there is a say critical violation, it can directly send you a Slack message, or it can open a Jira ticket for you.
Oh, nice.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's awesome. And do you have a complicated example of real life example of a policy?
Yeah, I think this is where I miss Ivan. So, but I'll summarize what he demoed today. So today, I think in the OpenShift environment where a cluster resource quota was created for a particular team. Along with that, you need to create a namespace for the team. You need to create role bindings. You need to make sure all the network policies are in place and all the resource quotas are in place, and maybe even create Argo project based on whatever the need is. So without Kyverno, you would have to do this, either maintain a script yourself saying if somebody requests for a new namespace or resource quota, do all these other XYZ things. Or you have to write your own custom operator that does this. And again, there's maintenance overhead and all of that. But with Kyverno, with just one or two policies, you can actually automate all of this. Like if somebody just say created a namespace, everything else follows, like resource quota, role bindings, their cluster roles, and all of things get associated for them. And your developer can... they don't have to worry about anything else. Like they don't have to worry about deploying something that can, in case of shared clusters, they are not really hogging another team's resources, for example. So your developers don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about it because the policies are already in place.
Cool. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I know.
And I think apart from the policy itself, one other common use case which I've seen is, for example, you have say 20 policies in enforce mode, and not all the time all these 20 policies make sense, right? You might actually want to run a pod in privileged mode for whatever reason it is. You might be okay with it because it's not an external facing application and you don't want to throw error every time, throw a violation every time because you have approved it. You acknowledge the risk and you want that to happen.
Yeah.
So usually, without Kyverno would be like you either disable that policy or somehow find a way to bypass the policy just for that whatever deployment. But with Kyverno, there's a concept called policy exception. So that's also a first-class resource in Kyverno. So you create a policy exception. This says for this policy and this rule, accept this particular resource. So whenever your resource is created, that policy won't be applied to that resource at all. And you can go as fine-grained as possible. You can even go to the exact deployment or pod name, or you can put it at a namespace level. But it is a very secure way to get exception from your policies. And at Nirmata, we have defined a workflow around it. Like a developer will come and request for an exception. Like, hey, security team, can I get an exception for this policy and this resource? Only after it's being reviewed and audited and approved, only then will you get an exception. And we also make sure that you don't have infinite lived exception, because if you have an exception, that never expires, then it means you don't need the policy at all. There's no point in having a policy. So we also do time-bound exceptions. So you can say after 2 weeks, this exception goes away. So whatever, say you want to do a debugging process or anything that you want with your deployment, you can do it. But after 2 weeks, your policy will be back in place. So that is, again, a very real-world, I think, use case that we are seeing.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, nice. So, do you have any other questions, Jan? No? Okay. Well, I have one last question.
Okay.
How do you see the future of Kubernetes? If I would put a crystal ball here on the table, what would you like to see in it?
That's a very interesting question. And I think I was just thinking about it yesterday.
Awesome.
There are no such thing as coincidence, right?
Yeah. So maybe Kubernetes itself is like too vast. I'd just like to focus on like what I was thinking about, because it was mostly about the security space, right? If security itself is evolving, like 2 years ago when I joined Nirmata, and when I went to my first KubeCon as a Nirmata employee, I had people come up to the Kyverno booth and ask like, hey, what is this project, right? It was just 2 years ago. And cut to the next KubeCon, which was just in 6 months, they were like, oh, we know Kyverno, what it does. Like, we like Kyverno. What can it do more? So with just every 3 to 6 months, you see such huge rise in awareness of security. People are paying more and more attention, mostly because of all the recent vulnerabilities and attacks that are happening. And people are, organizations are investing more in security. Otherwise, security was always an afterthought. But now people want to, when they want to say they're establishing a platform team, they also want to make security as part of the platform itself. So definitely there's more and more importance being given to security. And I think that will just continue to rise. But we also have this huge wave of AI come in. So there's no way of, getting rid of that. And it could be companies or projects or I think even individuals. We have to embrace it just like we embraced containerization and Kubernetes. I think we have to just embrace AI. And I think we have to get away from the fact that, this is from me as a product manager point of view where, instead of just having an AI feature, AI should be like a part of the product, right? It has to be a part of the security project itself, because more and more people want your project and product to be more intuitive instead of just blocking a deployment in one namespace. My product should be able to say, hey, you are running images in 10 other namespaces. Like, do you want me to go apply policies there as well? So it has to be more and more intuitive and context aware. So I think that is where security, today we see it as, just part of CVEs or misconfigurations. And then there's runtime security. I think we didn't talk about that. So there's runtime security as well. But all of this will have to come in together. So right from your code, from the time a developer writes code to the time it gets deployed in production, all of these are interlinked. But I see they're all treated as different projects or different responsibilities today. But, at Nirmata, we also say this security from code to cloud. That's what I think is going to happen, where, all these teams like dev, sec, ops teams, all of them are going to have to collaborate so that, their workloads are secure, not just from a security team point of view or a development point of view, but as an organization as a whole.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, very, very. Thank you very much for these insights.
We are going to use Kyverno.
Not only Kyverno, but she provided a lot of information about the global picture. So I think there's a lot of a good takeaway in the security aspect there. So I would like to invite you again sometime and talk a little bit more in depth about all the things you talked about. So thank you again very much, and see you again in the future.
Definitely. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Deze podcast is een initiatief van ACC ICT en wij zijn te beluisteren op onze website k8spodcast.nl, via Spotify, Apple en alle andere favoriete podcastproviders.